My name's Jennifer Cook, and I'm going to be presenting a paper that I wrote for an ethics panel, actually for the Phi Alpha Theta conference in New Orleans over winter break. So I originally wrote the paper for a class on the Cold War for Dr. Chapman, but it turned into a much bigger project than I intentionally planned. So what turned into a 20-page paper or above, I tried to condense into about 10 pages. So that's what I have here for you. Okay, so I'm just going to dive right in, and I have some images on the slideshow. When World War II ended in 1945, tensions were already rising to an uncomfortable degree between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Although the end of the war meant the end of the horrors inflicted by the Nazis under Adolf Hitler, it also meant that there would be an ensuing scramble by the powers left standing to gather all remaining resources that could be useful in future conflicts. Cold War history is a tale of two major world powers with conflicting ideologies. However, it is also a story of the results of fear and paranoia that lead nations to blur ethical lines. War materials and weapons were not the only things left behind by the Nazi war machine. Many of the scientists and physicists who were the brains behind Germany's greatest weapons and technology were left standing. Thus began Operation Paperclip, the U.S. intelligence program that sought to keep the lethal genius of the Nazi scientists from falling into the hands of the Soviets by granting military contracts to employ the individuals to American scientific and military programs. Believing that their accomplishments and abilities could far outweigh their past crimes, the U.S. government authorized the employment of hundreds of former Nazis, some of whom had been instrumental in the extermination camps and committed numerous war crimes during the Third Reich. The Cold War competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union pushed the boundaries of what was considered ethical and that which produced the greatest advantages. As Allied and Soviet troops closed in on the Germans in 1945, many U.S. military leaders became increasingly aware of an even greater threat than the Nazis: the question of who could possess the remaining German war materials and scientists that had so greatly advanced the weaponry and technology of Germany. The weapons and technology of the Germans was impressive and incredibly lethal, particularly the V weapons, also called the vengeance weapons. The fruit of the failed Nazi regime was ripe for the plucking, and the U.S. was well aware that the Soviets were also seeking such personnel and taking advantage of the opportunity to advance their own weapons technology. Neither the U.S. or the Soviet Union had reason to trust the other in the aftermath of the war, yet stood alone as the world's superpowers, expected to oversee the recovery of Europe. The U.S. government was fearful of the consequences if the German weapons, science, and technology were to fall into the hands of the Soviets, who had already expressed aggressive expansion policies in Eastern Europe and war-torn Europe. Soviet acquisition of German weapons and technology would eliminate the technological inferiority that had proved a historical weakness for the Russians. It was not only a threat to the recovery of Europe, but to world peace. Red Scares, excessive propaganda, and government documents such as NSC 68 added further anxiety to the communist threat in America, claiming that the Soviet Union was, quote, animated by a fanatical faith, seeking to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, also called the JIOA, was established in 1945 to combat the threat of German technology and brainpower falling into the hands of the Soviets. The JIOA formed as a subcommittee of the Joint Intelligence Committee, or the JIC, assigned to act as the advisory and intelligence service to the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the U.S. government on issues of policy and foreign affairs. The JIOA was created for the sole purpose of overseeing Operation Paperclip. The operation focused on the capture and recruitment of German scientists who had proved key players in the creation and advancements of the Third Reich's war machine. As the Allied forces pushed the Germans further back, joint British-American teams of researchers and soldiers, known as the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, or the CIOS, there's a lot of committees, followed closely behind, scouring abandoned Nazi headquarters and facilities in search of information and technology. As CIOS and Allied troops swept through freshly seized German territory, they interrogated German scientists and locals, confiscating war materials and valuable information as they went. Some scientists decided to remain at the facilities and bargain with the Allied forces upon their capture. Some fled to the safety of their homes and attempted to blend in with the locals, and others dedicated themselves entirely to destroying all evidence of biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons projects. As the CIOS teams As the CIOS teams made new discoveries in abandoned facilities and sorted through documents, certain names and mysterious projects began to surface. The Allied teams began to form blacklists of individuals who played key roles in German research and appeared to be the heads of various weapons projects. These blacklists created by the CIOS teams and US forces were not lists of criminals to be brought to justice. They were a list of highly desirable individuals that could prove useful to military and scientific programs in the US after the war. Two men in particular, however, would prove crucial to the legacy and success of Operation Paperclip in America: Werner von Braun and Arthur Rudolph. The most famous of the men recruited through Paperclip was Werner von Braun, the wunderkind physicist and mastermind behind the infamous V-2 rockets that devastated London and other parts of Europe throughout the war. The Germans were losing the war, and Hitler saw von Braun's rockets as an incredible weapon that could change the course of the war. The V-2 rockets were the first weapons resembling modern ballistic missiles and struck terror throughout Europe and the rest of the world. At the time the V-2 rockets were created and perfected by the Nazis, the US was 20 years behind the Germans in rocket development. After the Peenemünde Research Center, the location of von Braun's original rocket research and production, became vulnerable to the Allied bombing campaigns, Hitler decided to move the V-2 production underground into what would become the most brutal and deadly environment for Nazi prisoners. The new Center for V-Weapons Research and Production became the underground tunnel complex known as Mittelwerk, or Nordhausen. Once Hitler began eyeing von Braun's research, Himmler placed the rocket production and facility under the control of the brutal SS commander Hans Kammler, and the use of slave labor provided by the new Nordhausen camp kickstarted the production of Hitler's vengeance weapons. To be sent to Nordhausen was a death sentence. Because the Nazis feared that the prisoners would use the shovels and equipment as weapons, the prisoners were forced to dig the vast networks of tunnels with nothing but their bare hands. The prisoners lived in these tunnels with no fresh air, little light, and the constant burning of ammonia on their lungs. The starved prisoners were often crushed by the weight of the rocketry equipment that they were forced to transport through miles of tunnels, and others were beaten to death for not working fast enough. Out of 60,000 men enslaved to Mittelwerk, half of them were worked to death. Not only was Nordhausen the location of deadly slave labor and rocket production, but it was also the home base for many of Operation Paperclip's recruits. Key figures in the V-2 weapons development of Nordhausen and Peenemünde was Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and George Rickey. Engineer George Rickey was the self-proclaimed Mittelwerk general manager, the man in charge of all personnel and production facilities. Rickey was an ardent Nazi, and his main concern at Nordhausen was the procurement of slave labor, which basically functioned as a rent-to-slave business run by the SS throughout the Third Reich. Arthur Rudolph was also a key member of von Braun's rocketry team as an engineer and the Mittelwerk operations director. That means Rudolph oversaw all production and the assembly lines. He had direct contact and control over the slave labor and the horrible working conditions at Mittelwerk. The Nazi war machine and the numerous research facilities brought slave labor back into full swing and led the establishment of corporate concentration camps, in which prisoners were used as slave labor for scientific and technological facilities, such as Nordhausen or IG Farben Auschwitz. Despite von Braun's defiance of the SS-controlled rocket production and development and the military use of his missiles, his contributions to the German war machine and his Nazi affiliations proved highly controversial, and many questioned whether or not he had been directly involved with the slave labor. Von Braun stresses that his interest had always been space exploration and innovation, and outwardly disagreed with the decision to use his missiles and technology as weapons of war. Von Braun also defends his character by emphasizing that his arrest by the Gestapo was made when he refused to cooperate with the SS takeover of the facility. However, the fact that the arrest was made simply due to loose pessimistic comments and that his release was then followed by a grand medal ceremony rarely accompanies the story. For instance, a letter from von Braun to an associate that handled the labor at Nordhausen provides evidence that when the number of laborers proved insufficient, von Braun himself worked directly with Rudolph and Rickey in the procurement of more labor. He even took it upon himself to visit the Buchenwald concentration camp and choose, in his own words, the most qualified detainees from the camp and arrange for their transport to Nordhausen. When it became obvious to von Braun that the war was ending and Germany would surely be lost, he began planning for his post-war future. Realizing the threat facing himself and his research, Von Braun and his rocketry team surrendered to Allied troops. And in this image right here, you can see von Braun in the top middle and Hitler down at the bottom middle. They were able to salvage their futures by leveraging their abilities and knowledge of the weapons in order to obtain contracts with the US government. Despite the horrific nature of the Nordhausen facilities in which his work took place and the countless prisoners were worked to death, von Braun and his rocketry team were able to further their research in America and begin new lives. Once in the US, von Braun focused his talents on space exploration and further development of rockets that could take man into space, the passion he claims to have always wanted to pursue. Von Braun became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where he went on to make his next big mark on the future of space exploration and technology. His research and ambition came at a dire time in the US space program. The space race was in full swing, and Americans were alarmed by the Soviet Union's launching of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957. He was the chief architect of the Saturn V booster, and his research was instrumental in the first ever Apollo moon landing. Despite von Braun's rise to celebrity status and image as an American hero after the moon landing, the shadow of his Nazi past remained. As the years passed, more and more information began to surface concerning the true nature of his role in the Third Reich. Von Braun was not as clean as the government had made him seem. Many ambiguities clouded the issue of responsibility and criminality for the slave labor and the scientific research by figures such as von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and other Operation Paperclip recruits. What makes the aftermath of the Nazi regime so unique is the complexity of guilt. There were those who were directly involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity who pulled the trigger. Then there were those who joined the Nazi Party to avoid trouble and reap the benefits, who stood back and watched thousands die. Are they guilty for cooperating and doing nothing? Von Braun did not pull the trigger or crack the whip. He did not preach Hitler's ideology as an ardent Nazi. He dreamed that his rockets would be used for space exploration, not war. However, von Braun knowingly participated in research that reaped the benefits of corporate slave labor. Seeing the horrors of Nordhausen and Dora did not slow his research or hinder his dedication to his rockets. Von Braun claims that in his visits to Nordhausen, he never witnessed poor treatment, beatings, or killings, yet first-hand accounts by survivors and associates of von Braun himself proved that it would have been impossible to avoid witnessing the atrocities. Arthur Rudolph, however, a key figure in von Braun's rocket development in the US and Nazi Germany, was not so lucky, and was later proved by the Justice Department in later investigations to have been instrumental in the enforcement of the slave labor at the facility. When faced with the options to stand trial for war crimes or renounce his citizenship, Rudolph chose to avoid prosecution and left the US in 1983 as an old man. The initial objectives of Operation Paperclip were controversial in nature, but the way in which the JIOA went about obtaining the visas and residency for the scientists once already in US military custody sheds further light on the secretive nature and controversy surrounding the operation. The JIOA assumed complete control over the issuance of visas, pre-examinations, and final clearance of individuals involved in the operation. Whenever a deadlock occurred between the State Department and the JIOA concerning the scientists' Nazi affiliation or past crimes, the JIOA had the scientists' dossiers cleansed of sensitive information to get men cleared. A top-secret directive was passed by the JIOA, known as the JIOA 257-22, stating, quote, "The Department of State would accept as final the investigation and security reports prepared by the JIOA." To understand the motivation behind such a controversial operation, we must first analyze the mindset of the JIOA and the JIC. The JIC is one of the least researched US intelligence agencies of the 21st century. Within 1 year of the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the JIC warned that the US should prepare for total war with the Soviet Union. The JIC even went as far as to set a potential start date in 1952. According to the JIC and the JIOA, this total war would involve atomic, chemical, and biological warfare. According to the leaders of Paperclip and the JIOA, if the US had not removed these men, their technology from Germany, as foreign forces swept through, the Russians would have taken them by force and used the scientists to advance the militaristic agenda of the communist expansion throughout war-torn Europe. When the secret military program was exposed in 1947 by leaked information concerning certain German scientists, there was a frenzy of opposition among the American public and the scientific community. The JIOA attempted to present a shiny picture of the program to the American public in order to save the operation, painting the German scientists as human beings whose talents had simply been used by an oppressive regime. The scientific community and many others were not fooled. Rabbi Stephen S. Wise accurately expressed the emotional reaction of many who were horrified by the operation. Quote, "As long as we reward former servants of Hitler while leaving his victims in displaced persons camp, we cannot even pretend that we are making any real effort to achieve what we fought for," end quote. The victims of the Nazi regime were, in a sense, being denied justice. Thousands lost their lives at the expense of scientific research and weapons projects. Fellow German scientists who chose to leave Germany instead of working for Hitler presented the most moving arguments. The esteemed Albert Einstein publicly denounced Operation Paperclip and personally appealed to President Truman, stating, "We hold these individuals to be potentially dangerous. Their former eminence as Nazi Party members and supporters raises the issue of their fitness to become American citizens and hold key positions in American industrial, scientific, and educational institutions." Popular opposition to Operation Paperclip asked the question, was science worth any price? The government, in particular, the JIOA, believed that there was no price too high to ensure U.S. military superiority in scientific advancement. Although the operation did hinder the threat of the Soviets acquiring more German technology to expand communism and pose an international threat, the operation was first and foremost focused on the advantages to the programs of the U.S. The scientists were not brought to the U.S. simply for preventative measures and appropriately punished for their crimes in an attempt to withhold them from the Russians, but were given visas and influential positions in prominent government programs. They were given new lives. Although the advantages and consequences of Operation Paperclip are complex, the facts of the operation are simple. The U.S. government, in the name of national security, authorized the employment of Nazi scientists for government intelligence and military agencies. The world was entering into an age of weapons of mass destruction and brinkmanship. This was the age of bombs that could annihilate entire cities, and the age of democratic nations hiring war criminals for their brainpower and advantages. The foundations of what was considered ethical during times of war, whether hot or cold, was changing. Operation Paperclip was in fact ugly but complex, because however criminal these scientists were, it cannot be denied that they contributed greatly to U.S. technology and science programs during the Cold War, and their talent could have been an incredible threat if captured by the Russians. Yes, Paperclip recruits such as Werner von Braun made amazing contributions to U.S. scientific programs. However, is it just or ethical that countless victims of the actions of these men are denied justice simply on the basis that their perpetrators happen to be geniuses? Have any questions? Thank you very much. Oh. Actually, the class that I wrote this paper for, the Cold War class, we looked a lot at South America. And there is a school in Fort Benning that trains, I wouldn't go as far to say nuclear physicists such as this, but does train individuals to go into countries and work for the US government. And there's also other instances in Europe that I believe this happens. I can't speak to CIA operations or secret operations by the government, but I do believe that in situations like this, and especially during a time of war, such as the Cold War was very unique in the way the government operated and other governments operated. So I do believe that it probably has been done and will continue to be done. Okay, thank you guys.